Welcome back to the Sleepkeeper's Library. I am the historian, keeper of the forgotten crafts and the patient hands that shaped our world. My colleagues in this library tend to different treasures. The Myth Keeper guards the stories that refuse to be forgotten, her collection holding the myths and legends that shaped how humans understood time itself. The Wanderer walks through histories that never were, exploring timelines where time might have been measured differently, or perhaps not measured at all. But I preserve the memory of those who made time tangible, who transformed the abstract flow of hours into something you could hold in your palm, something that would tick faithfully in your pocket for decades, passing from father to son, marking births and deaths and all the moments between. Tonight, I've discovered something particularly fascinating in my archives. Records from a clockmaker's workshop in London, 1783. A time when every timepiece was a small miracle of human precision, when measuring hours required not machinery but mathematics, metallurgy, and an almost supernatural patience. Let me take you to a workshop on Clerkenwell Road, where Master Thomas Earnshaw is beginning work on a gentleman's pocket watch. The kind of timepiece that would cost a craftsman's yearly wages, that would require 3 months of patient work, that would outlive everyone in the room. So settle in, dear listener. Adjust your pillows and make yourself comfortable. We're going to watch time being made, measured not in seconds and minutes, but in the gradual accumulation of tiny, perfect movements. The workshop smells of metal and oil, not unpleasant, but sharp and purposeful. There's the acrid tang of brass filings, the faint sweetness of fine machine oil, and underneath it all, the warm scent of beeswax used to seal the floorboards against dust. In a clockmaker's workshop, dust is the enemy. A single grain of grit between gear teeth can stop time itself. Thomas arrives before dawn, as he always does, not because the work demands urgency, but because morning light is truest. The sun rising through the workshop's tall windows illuminates without the yellow cast of candles, lets him see the metal truly. By the time his journeyman, young Peter, arrives at 6, Thomas has already been working for an hour. On the workbench before him, sheets of brass no thicker than paper, steel blanks, jewels the size of pinheads, coils of wire finer than human hair. These are the raw materials of time. In 3 months, if all goes well, there'll be a pocket watch keeping accurate time to within a minute per week. A small miracle of precision. Thomas begins with the mainspring, the heart that will beat inside this watch for decades. It's a ribbon of tempered steel, and everything depends on getting it right. Too soft, and it loses power quickly. Too hard, and it shatters. The steel must remember its coil without resenting it, must store energy without protest. He selects his steel carefully, running it through his fingers. The metal is cold, almost alive in its responsiveness. He can feel the grain of it, the slight variations that indicate quality. This piece comes from Sheffield, where they've been making steel for centuries. The maker's mark is barely visible, a small anchor stamped into one corner. The tempering process requires fire and ice, heat and intuition. Thomas sets up his small forge in the corner of the workshop, where the chimney draws well. He'll heat the steel until it glows cherry red, then quench it in oil at precisely the right moment. Too soon, and it stays soft. Too late, and it becomes brittle. Peter works the bellows with steady rhythm, bringing the coals to the right temperature. The workshop fills with warmth, with the particular smell of heating metal, something mineral and ancient, like the earth itself, remembering when it was molten. Thomas watches the steel intently as it enters the flames. He's done this perhaps 10,000 times, but each spring is different. Each piece of steel has its own personality, its own way of responding to heat. The color change is subtle at first, from dull grey to brown, like old iron. Then hints of purple appear at the edges, iridescent as oil on water. The purple deepens, spreads, then gives way to blue. But Thomas isn't waiting for blue, not yet. He needs the steel hotter, transformed at its deepest level. The blue brightens, then suddenly shifts. Cherry red appears at the center of the steel, spreading outward like a blush. Not orange, not yellow. Cherry, the color of ripe fruit, of summer sunsets, of blood in firelight. At this precise moment, the steel's crystal structure is transforming, the iron atoms rearranging themselves into something harder, stronger, different from what they were. Now, Thomas lifts the steel with long tongs, tools his grandfather made, worn smooth by 3 generations of hands. He moves without hesitation, because hesitation means the temperature drops, means the moment passes. The steel plunges into the oil bath with a sound like a scream, high and brief. The workshop fills with smoke, acrid and sharp, and the smell of burning oil that catches in the back of your throat. The metal hisses its protest, steam and smoke rising from the bath. Peter steps back from the heat and fumes, but Thomas leans closer, watching. The hissing changes pitch, becomes quieter, more settled. When he lifts the spring from the oil, it's black with carbon, dripping, transformed. The steel is harder now, could scratch glass, could hold an edge sharp enough to shave with. But tempering isn't finished. This is only the first stage, the hardening. The steel is too brittle now, would snap like glass if bent. It needs to be drawn back, softened slightly, given flexibility to match its hardness. This is the delicate balance, hard enough to store energy, soft enough to bend without breaking. Thomas cleans the surface with fine sand and a cloth, scrubbing away the black carbon until the steel gleams silver grey. The metal is still slightly warm from the quenching, pleasant to touch. He returns it to the forge, but this time the heat is gentler. Peter adjusts the bellows, reducing the airflow, letting the coals settle into a steady, lower temperature. Now Thomas watches for different colours, not the dramatic reds of high heat, but the subtle oxides that form on clean steel when heated gently. These colours appear in order, each one corresponding to a specific temperature, each one changing the steel's properties in precise ways. First comes pale yellow, like straw in afternoon sunlight. It spreads across the steel surface, thin as thought. Too hot and the yellow would deepen to gold, but Thomas pulls it from the heat before that happens. He lets it cool slightly, watching the colour hold steady, then returns it to the warmth. Brown appears next, like autumn leaves, like old parchment. The steel is becoming slightly softer, slightly more flexible. Peter watches carefully, learning to read metal the way some men read books. The brown darkens at the edges, and Thomas rotates the steel, keeping the colour even across its length. Then purple, sudden and beautiful, like twilight on water. But Thomas isn't stopping for purple either. He's waiting for blue, a particular shade of blue that has no name, that exists only in this moment between hard and soft, between brittle and flexible. Not sky blue, not steel blue, but something in between. It appears like watercolor spreading across paper, pale at first, then deepening. This blue represents around 300 degrees, the temperature where steel gains what craftsmen call spring temper. Hard enough to store energy, flexible enough to coil and uncoil millions of times without breaking or losing its shape. Into the oil again, final quench. The hissing is quieter this time, the smoke less dramatic. When Thomas lifts the spring, it's done. He sets it on the bench to cool completely, and in the growing morning light, he can see the faint blue colour still visible on its surface, proof of its tempering. Outside, the street is waking. A milk cart rattles past, bottles clinking. Someone calls out the morning's fish prices. The bells of St. James's Clerkenwell ring 6, marking the hour. But inside the workshop, time itself is being made, one careful step at a time. The mainspring lies cooling on the bench, ready to become the beating heart of a mechanism that will measure out someone's days for decades to come. Thomas wipes his hands on his leather apron, leaving dark smudges. Peter returns the forge to its resting state, banking the coals. They'll need heat again later, but for now, the dangerous work is done. The spring must cool slowly, naturally, no rushing. Some things cannot be hurried, no matter how skilled the craftsman. With the mainspring tempered and set aside to cool completely, Thomas turns his attention to the gears, the wheels that will translate the spring's power into the steady tick of passing seconds. This is where mathematics becomes metal, where abstract ratios take physical form. A pocket watch contains perhaps 50 individual gears, each one precisely calculated. The mainspring wheel, which the spring coils around. The center wheel, which completes one rotation per hour. The third wheel, the fourth wheel, the escape wheel, each turning at different speeds, each with teeth cut to exact specifications. Get one tooth wrong by a fraction of a millimeter, and time speeds up or slows down. The watch becomes decoration instead of tool. Thomas begins with brass blanks, circles of metal he cast last week, each one slightly larger than a shilling. They're rough still, needing to be turned true on the lathe, but the metal is good brass, 70% copper to 30% zinc. This ratio gives strength without brittleness, workability without softness. He's drawn the calculations in his ledger, numbers that determine how many teeth each wheel needs, how deep each cut must be, what angle each tooth requires. The mathematics are elegant in their necessity. The escape wheel needs 15 teeth, always 15 for this type of escapement. The fourth wheel, which carries the seconds hand, needs 48 teeth. The third wheel needs 40. These numbers aren't arbitrary. They're derived from the natural oscillation of the balance wheel, from the rate at which the mainspring unwinds, from the relationship between seconds and minutes and hours. Change one number, and you must recalculate everything else. First, he must true each blank on the lathe. Thomas fits the first wheel, the largest one, the mainspring wheel, onto the lathe's mandrel. The lathe itself is a beautiful tool, built by a craftsman in Birmingham 20 years ago. Its bed is cast iron, worn smooth by use, and it turns with a precision that still impresses him. He powers it with a foot treadle, the rhythm of his leg becoming the rhythm of the turning wheel. The brass blank spins, and Thomas brings a sharp cutting tool to its edge. Brass spirals peel away, golden and delicate as flower petals. The smell is distinctive. Brass has a sweetness to it when cut, almost like honey mixed with metal. The tool chatters slightly when he presses too hard, leaving a rough surface, so he eases back, letting the metal come away in its own time. The blank becomes perfectly circular, its edge catching the morning light as it spins. Thomas measures it with his calipers, brass dividers worn to a dull gold by his hands, 32 millimeters exactly. He nods, removes it from the lathe, and begins the next blank. This work is repetitive, meditative. The foot treadle rocks back and forth. The lathe hums its steady note. Brass spirals accumulate on the floor. By mid-morning, all 6 primary wheels are trued and ready for marking. Now comes the work that separates a master from a journeyman, dividing each wheel into its precise number of teeth. Thomas uses a dividing engine, a device he built himself years ago based on principles developed by clockmakers before him. It's essentially a graduated circular plate marked with precise degrees, a mechanical protractor that lets him divide a circle into exact segments. For the escape wheel's 15 teeth, he sets the engine to mark every 24 degrees, 360 degrees in a circle divided by 15 teeth, equals 24 degrees per tooth. Simple mathematics, but the execution requires absolute steadiness. Thomas rests his elbows on the bench, steadies his breathing, brings the scribe to the brass surface. A light touch, just enough to scratch a line visible in good light. Too heavy, and the brass deforms, creating a valley that will affect the cutting. Too light, and the mark vanishes when he starts filing. He makes the first mark, rotates the dividing engine exactly 24 degrees, makes the second mark. The scribe makes a faint scratching sound, like a mouse in the walls. Around the wheel he goes, checking each mark, counting twice. When he's marked all 15 positions, he holds the wheel up to the light, turning it slowly. The marks are evenly spaced, as perfect as human hands can make them. Peter watches from his own workbench, where he's marking the larger, simpler wheels. The apprentice has been with Thomas for 2 years now, and his marks are getting better, more confident. But he still checks each one twice, which is good. Confidence without caution makes poor clockmakers. Now comes the cutting. Thomas uses files so small they look like toys. Tiny triangular files with teeth finer than human hair. Each tooth on the gear must be cut individually, by hand, to a depth that varies by the wheel's size and purpose. The escape wheel's teeth are perhaps a millimetre deep, but they must all be exactly the same depth, exactly the same shape. He secures the wheel in a wooden jig he made specifically for this purpose. The jig holds the wheel steady while allowing him to rotate it between cuts. Thomas selects his file, the finest one, kept wrapped in oiled leather when not in use, and begins the first tooth. The sound of filing is rhythmic, almost musical. A soft whisper of steel against brass, repeated in short strokes. Thomas files from the outer edge toward the center, following the angle he's calculated. The brass resists at first, then yields, producing a fine golden powder that clings to the file and falls to the bench in tiny glints. Each tooth takes perhaps 3 minutes to cut. 3 minutes of careful, steady pressure, checking the depth with his eye, testing the smoothness with his thumbnail. His thumbnails are worn flat from years of this testing, but they're more sensitive than any instrument. A rough edge here, a slightly wrong angle there. His thumb finds them all. The window light shifts as morning turns to afternoon. Thomas completes the first tooth, rotates the wheel to the next mark, begins again. The whisper of the file, the fall of brass dust, the rhythm of his breathing. Peter works on his own wheel, and occasionally their filing sounds overlap, creating a counterpoint, 2 rhythms interweaving. By the time the church bells mark noon, Thomas has completed 5 teeth. 10 remain. His back aches from leaning over the bench, and his eyes are tired from the close work, but the teeth are perfect. He stands, stretches, walks to the window. Outside, the street is busy with the midday trade. Carters delivering goods, shop boys running errands, a pie seller calling his wares. Thomas eats bread and cheese at his bench, not wanting to break his concentration entirely. Peter does the same. They don't speak much during work like this. The craft requires a kind of meditation, a stillness of mind that conversation would disrupt. The bread is yesterday's, slightly stale, but the cheese is good. Sharp cheddar from a farm outside the city. Afternoon light is different from morning light. Warmer, more yellow. Thomas lights a candle to supplement it, positioning the flame carefully to illuminate his work without creating harsh shadows. The candle is pure beeswax, expensive but necessary. Tallow candles smoke too much, leaving soot that attracts dust, and dust is death to precision work. He returns to the filing. Tooth 6, 7, 8. The file must be cleaned periodically. The brass dust clogs between its teeth, reducing its effectiveness. Thomas uses a brass brush for this, drawing it across the file's surface in steady strokes. The brush itself is worn, its bristles splayed, but it still does the work. As he files, Thomas explains to Peter the theory behind the tooth shape. See how each tooth has a face and a flank. The face is what drives the next wheel. The flank is what allows the teeth to separate without binding. In theory, if you calculated everything perfectly, the teeth would be simple triangles. But in practice, he pauses to test a tooth with his thumbnail, feeling for the subtle undercut. In practice, perfect geometry would bind. The teeth would grab each other, resist motion, so each tooth is undercut slightly here. He indicates the spot, relieved at the back, given room to breathe. It's not mathematics anymore, it's feel, intuition, the knowledge that lives in hands rather than books. Peter nods, understanding in the way apprentices do, partially through explanation, mostly through observation and repetition. He'll file 10,000 teeth before his hands know what Thomas's hands know. But he'll get there if he's patient. The afternoon lengthens. Tooth 9, 10, 11. Thomas's rhythm never varies. The same number of strokes per tooth, the same pressure, the same careful testing. This consistency is what creates precision, not genius, not inspiration, but repetition guided by attention. At tooth 12, a customer appears at the door. The gentleman who commissioned this watch, anxious to know when it will be ready. He's a merchant, successful enough to afford such a timepiece, but new enough to wealth that he doesn't understand patience. Thomas doesn't look up from his filing, just says quietly, "When it's finished, sir." Perhaps 2 months more. "But surely," the gentleman begins. "You can't hurry precision," Thomas says, still not looking up. His tone isn't rude, just matter of fact. Each tooth must be perfect, or the watch won't keep time. Would you rather have it fast, or would you rather have it right? The gentleman nods, understanding, or at least accepting. He knows Thomas's reputation. Men come from across London to have watches made in this workshop because Thomas's watches keep time. Not approximately, actually. They can be set by the sun and will still agree with the sun weeks later. That reputation is built on moments like this, on the willingness to say, "When it's finished," and mean it. The door closes. Thomas continues filing. Tooth 13, 14, 15. The last tooth is always the most careful, because there's no correcting it if you make a mistake. 15 teeth, all perfectly spaced, all identical in depth and shape. He holds the wheel up to the candlelight, turning it slowly, checking each tooth. Perfect. Now he must do the same with 5 more wheels. The 4th wheel with its 48 teeth will take most of tomorrow, but that's tomorrow's work. For now, Thomas sets the completed escape wheel aside and begins preparing the next blank. The afternoon is fading toward evening, but there are still hours of usable light. and the rhythm of the work has settled into his bones. 3 weeks have passed since Thomas tempered the mainspring and cut the first gears. The workshop has settled into its rhythm. Mornings for the finest work, afternoons for assembly and testing, evenings for planning the next day. Now finally, all the components are ready. The wheels are cut and polished. The pivots, sharp points that will spin in jeweled holes, are turned and hardened. The plates that will sandwich everything together are drilled and fitted. Today, Thomas will assemble the watch and discover whether his calculations, his measurements, his 3 weeks of careful work have produced something that actually keeps time. He begins before dawn, as always. The assembly requires the calmest part of the day, before the street noise builds, before the inevitable interruptions. Peter arrives early too, knowing this is the critical moment. He's cleaned the workbench twice, ensuring not a speck of dust remains. He's laid out Thomas's tools in order. Tweezers, screwdrivers, oilers, each one spotless. The base plate comes first, the foundation on which everything else builds. It's brass, polished to a mirror finish, about the size of a crown coin. Thomas has already drilled holes for the pivots, each hole positioned with mathematical precision. Now he presses tiny jewels into these holes, bits of garnet, hard and smooth, that will cradle the rotating pivots and reduce friction to almost nothing. The jewels are smaller than pinheads, and fitting them requires tweezers with tips fine as needle points. Thomas works with a jeweler's loop screwed into his eye socket, magnifying his view. At this scale, the base plate looks like a landscape, the polished brass like a mirror lake, the holes like wells, his fingerprints like canyons. A single breath could blow a jewel across the bench and lose it forever in the floor cracks. He fits the first jewel, pressing it into its hole with a tiny punch. It should fit snugly but not tightly, tight enough to stay put, loose enough not to crack. The jewel clicks into place with a sound so quiet only Thomas hears it, felt more than heard through the tools. 1 down, 47 more to go. By the time full morning light fills the workshop, all the jewels are in place. The base plate looks like a night sky now, the garnets catching light like small stars. Thomas removes the loop from his eye. After hours of magnified work, the normal world looks strangely distant for a moment, and blinks to clear his vision. Now comes the wheel train. Each wheel must be positioned exactly, its pivot resting in its jeweled hole, engaging with the next wheel at the precise depth. Too shallow and the teeth barely touch, causing them to slip. Too deep and they bind, creating friction that steals energy from the mainspring. Thomas starts with the mainspring barrel, the largest wheel, which contains the coiled spring. He's already mounted the spring inside its housing, can feel its tension as he handles it. 3 weeks ago, this was straight steel. Now it's coiled tight, storing energy, ready to unwind slowly and drive the entire mechanism. He positions the barrel on the base plate, its pivot finding its jewel. The barrel sits there, perfectly balanced, and Thomas experiences a moment of satisfaction so pure it's almost painful. This is what the work is for. Not money, though he needs that. Not reputation, though he values it. But this moment when mathematics and metal align, when theory becomes reality. The center wheel next, its teeth engaging with the mainspring barrel. Thomas holds his breath as he lowers it into place. If he's calculated wrong, if the spacing is off by even a hair's width, the teeth won't mesh properly. The wheel settles, and he turns the barrel slightly. The center wheel rotates smoothly, driven by the barrel's teeth. Perfect. The third wheel, then the fourth. Each one must engage with the previous wheel at precisely the right depth. Thomas uses a depth tool, a gauge he made himself to check each meshing point. The teeth should engage about halfway up their height, too deep, and they bind, too shallow, and they can skip under load. The escape wheel is last and most critical. Its 15 teeth must engage with the lever escapement, which will regulate the entire mechanism. Thomas positions it carefully, checking the depth 3 times. The escape wheel sits between the fourth wheel and the balance wheel, the threshold between the steady unwinding of the spring and the oscillating heartbeat that divides time into countable moments. Now for the escapement itself, the mechanism that makes a watch tick. Thomas has spent 2 days on this component alone, cutting and polishing the lever, adjusting its pivots, ensuring it moves freely but without play. The lever is a tiny piece of steel shaped like a shallow Y, no longer than a grain of rice. At each tip of the Y is a small ruby stone polished flat. These rubies will catch and release the escape wheel's teeth 1 tooth at a time, converting the smooth rotation of the wheel train into discrete intervals. But they can only do this if the balance wheel oscillates regularly, pushing the lever back and forth at a steady rate. And the balance wheel will only oscillate regularly if everything, its weight distribution, the tension of its hairspring, the friction in its pivots, is perfect. Thomas fits the lever to the base plate, checking its movement. It rocks back and forth smoothly, its rubies positioned to intercept the escape wheel's teeth. Now comes the balance wheel, the soul of accuracy, the component that determines whether this watch will keep time or be merely decorative. The balance wheel is perhaps his finest work. A brass ring no wider than a shilling, perfectly circular, perfectly balanced. He spent hours on its weight distribution, filing away microscopic amounts of metal, weighing it after each adjustment. If he suspends it on its pivots and gives it a slight spin, it rotates until friction stops it, but never favors one side over another. No heavy side, no light side, just perfect equilibrium. The hairspring is already attached, a spiral of steel so fine it's barely visible, yet strong enough to control the balance wheel's oscillation. This spring came from a specialist in Geneva because making hairsprings is its own craft, requiring skills Thomas has never mastered. The spring arrived coiled perfectly, and his job was to attach it without disturbing its temper or form. He lowers the balance wheel into position, its pivot settling into its jeweled hole. For a moment, everything is still. Then Thomas gives the balance wheel the slightest push with the tip of a feather. The wheel rotates, compressing the hairspring. The spring pushes back. The wheel rotates in the opposite direction. The cycle begins. And the lever, pushed by the balance wheel, releases 1 tooth of the escape wheel. The escape wheel advances slightly, pushing the fourth wheel, which pushes the third wheel, which pushes the center wheel, which is driven by the mainspring barrel. The entire train of wheels advances by 1 precise increment. Tick. The balance wheel swings back. The lever catches the next tooth. Another increment. Tick. And again. Tick. The watch is alive. Thomas and Peter both hold their breath, listening. The ticking is quiet, rapid, 5 beats per second, but absolutely regular. The balance wheel oscillates. The escapement catches and releases. The wheels turn at their prescribed rates. Time is being measured, divided into seconds, accumulated into minutes. But alive isn't enough. The watch must also be accurate. Thomas carefully places the top plate over the mechanism, securing it with tiny screws. Each screw must be tightened just right, too loose and the plates separate, allowing the pivots to wobble. Too tight and the brass deforms, binding the pivots. He tightens each screw a quarter turn at a time, checking the ticking after each adjustment. The watch continues running. He winds the mainspring fully, about 7 turns, and sets the watch next to his regulator clock, the large precision timepiece he uses as a standard. Both are ticking now. The regulator's tick is slow, authoritative, the sound of a much larger mechanism. The pocket watch's tick is quick, eager, almost impatient. Now comes the test, the waiting. Over the next hour, Thomas will watch both timepieces, comparing their rates. If the pocket watch gains or loses more than a few seconds per hour, he'll need to adjust the regulator pins that affect the hairspring's active length. Lengthening the active part of the spring slows the oscillation. Shortening it speeds things up. Peter returns to his own work, knowing this isn't something he can help with. This is between Thomas and his creation, between craftsman and craft. The morning passes in focused silence, broken only by the dual ticking of the 2 clocks marking time at their different scales. After an hour of observation, Thomas checks the comparison. The pocket watch is 3 seconds slow against the regulator. He nods. This is good, easily corrected. 3 seconds per hour means the balance wheel is oscillating slightly too slowly. He needs to shorten the active length of the hairspring, just barely. Using tweezers and a magnifying glass, Thomas adjusts the regulator pins, tiny brass fingers that pinch the hairspring at a specific point, determining how much of the spring can actually flex. He moves them inward perhaps 1/10 of a millimeter. The adjustment is so small it's almost invisible, but at the scale of oscillation, it matters. He winds the mainspring again and resets the hands to match the regulator. Both clocks tick their different rhythms, measuring the same moments. Thomas returns to his bench and begins work on another component, but part of his attention never leaves the 2 timepieces. Another hour passes. The church bells of St. James's mark 3 o'clock. One of the bells is slightly flat, has been for years, gives the chime its particular character that everyone in Clerkenwell knows. Thomas checks his comparison again. The pocket watch is now 1 second fast. Closer, much closer. One more tiny adjustment, moving the regulator pins outward this time, lengthening the hairspring by a hair's width. By evening, the watch and the regulator agree to within seconds over a full hour, close enough for now. Over the coming weeks, Thomas will continue testing, adjusting, testing again. The watch will need to prove itself in different positions, dial up, dial down, pendant up, because gravity affects the balance wheel slightly depending on orientation. But the heart of the work is done. Time has been captured, made portable, made reliable. In 3 months, when every component is complete and the case is fitted, this watch will go into the world. It will ride in a gentleman's waistcoat pocket, marking his appointments, his journeys, the hours of his life. Long after Thomas's hands have stilled, this mechanism will continue its steady beat, measuring moments that no one owns, but everyone shares. As I close this volume and return it to my collection, I find myself thinking, as I often do, about the nature of time itself. We treat it as something we possess. My time, your time, spare time, lost time. But time isn't owned. It simply is, flowing whether we measure it or not. What Thomas has made isn't time itself, but a tool for agreeing about time, for synchronizing human activity, for creating the shared reality we call schedules and appointments and deadlines. I wonder what my colleague, the Mythkeeper, has in her collection about humanity's relationship with time. Stories of gods who controlled the hours, of mortality and immortality, of the human need to measure our brief moments against the infinite. Every culture has tales of time. Time that flows differently, time that can be stolen, time as gift and time as curse. We've always been fascinated and frightened by time's passage in equal measure. And I wonder what the Wanderer has discovered in his alternate timelines. Perhaps there's a world where clockmakers developed different mechanisms, where time is measured in different intervals, where the steady tick-tock we know is replaced by some other rhythm entirely. Or perhaps a timeline where humanity never felt the need to capture time at all, where people lived by the sun and seasons and never knew the tyranny of minutes that must be accounted for, appointments that must be kept. But here, in my collection, I preserve what was, the memory of hands that measured time by making it visible, the sound of tiny gears engaging, of balance wheels oscillating, of mainspring storing the energy that would mark out human days. The quiet dignity of work so precise it seems impossible, yet repeated in workshops across centuries by craftsmen whose names we've mostly forgotten, but whose skill persists in the mechanisms they left behind. Thomas's watch, once finished and cased, will outlive him. It will pass from father to son, will mark births and deaths, will tick faithfully through wars and peace, through the fall of empires and the rise of new ones. Someone will wind it every morning for decades, will consult it before every appointment, will set other clocks by its accuracy, and perhaps, generations later, someone will open the case and marvel at the tiny jeweled mechanism inside, at the delicacy of the balance wheel, at the precision of the gear teeth, and wonder at the patience of the hands that made it. This is what gets lost when we speak of efficiency, of progress, of machines that can stamp out 1,000 watch parts in the time Thomas files one tooth. Yes, more people can afford timepieces now. Yes, accuracy has improved beyond what any handmade watch could achieve. But something else was traded away in that bargain. The knowledge that lives only in skilled hands, the meditation of precision work, the connection between maker and made, the understanding that some things cannot be rushed because their value lies partly in the time spent creating them. Thank you for spending these hours with me, here among the forgotten crafts and patient hands of history. The workshop is quiet now, the evening settling over Clerkenwell, but somewhere in these archives, Thomas's watch still ticks, measuring out moments in its steady rhythm, a small mechanical heart that refuses to stop beating. If this journey brought you comfort or sparked curiosity about the hands that built our world with such care, I hope you'll return next week. I'll be here, opening another volume, sharing another vanished voice, another lost art that deserves to be remembered. Until then, rest well, dear listener. Let time slow for a while. Let the steady tick of hours fade into quiet. The library waits always for those who seek the stories of how things were made and, more importantly, why they mattered. Good night.